Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking a look at another high-end 1440p 240Hz IPS gaming monitor, but this one is a little bit different to the others that we've looked at on the channel so far. It's the Gigabyte Aorus FI27Q-X, a monitor many of you have been begging us to take a look at, so today we're going to cover how it performs in detail. The FI27Q-X offers the same basic specifications as other high-end 1440p monitors on the market today. That is to say, it has a 27-inch screen size, 2560 by 1440 resolution at up to 240Hz. It uses a flat panel with IPS technology, wide color gamut support, G-Sync and FreeSync support, all the usual stuff. The idea with these sorts of monitors is that they are so packed with future tech and high refresh rates that they will last you several generations of PC hardware upgrades and support a versatile range of gaming, whether that's competitive esports titles or single-player AAA games. Where this monitor differs from the others we've tested on the channel so far, like the Alienware AW2721D and Asus ROG Swift PG279QM, is firstly in the panel being used here. While those two aforementioned monitors use panels from LG and AU Optronics, the FI27Q-X uses a panel from Sharp. So there's quite a number of options available for monitor manufacturers to use in high-end gaming displays these days, and naturally performance will differ between them. Gigabyte have also decided not to use Nvidia's G-Sync processor. The monitor is still G-Sync compatible certified, but the actual module is not being used. The combination of using a Sharp panel and not using a G-Sync module has made the FI27Q-X one of the cheapest 1440p 240Hz monitors you can get. Now, this isn't really a cheap monitor. At a $700 US MSRP, but often seen around $650, it's more in the mid-range of monitor pricing today, but it is somewhat more affordable than other displays we've seen that are usually priced over $800. So if performance stacks up well against those options, Gigabyte are onto a winner here. The design Gigabyte have opted for here is very similar to their previous Aorus monitors in that the overall aesthetic is very gamer focused. On the rear, for example, you'll see some RGB LED lighting built into the display section and the stand, which doesn't really offer much. Now, the overall look here isn't too bad. I certainly prefer this to an Asus ROG design, but it also won't fit well with a more understated look you may be going for in your setup. Aside from the looks, there is little doubt the FI27Q-X is a well-built monitor. The stand has quite impressive metal legs that look good in my opinion, and they extend up into a strong pillar that is ergonomically adjustable without much wobble. You can do all of the usual tilt, swivel, pivot, and height adjustments, which I'd expect from a high-end display, and the overall build quality is great. On the rear, you'll find a display port plus two HDMI 2.0 ports. Unfortunately, Gigabyte are not using HDMI 2.1 here, which means the HDMI ports are limited to just 144Hz at the screen's native resolution. HDMI 2.1 has been around for long enough now that really it should be included when HDMI 2.0 is insufficient to reach the display's maximum capabilities, particularly for a high-end product. On a more positive note, Gigabyte continues to have a strong feature set present in their OSD, which is controllable through an easy-to-use directional toggle. Gigabyte's active noise cancellation feature that we've talked about before is cool, and there's other stuff in here like the usual game assist features and the OSD sidekick stuff if you're interested. Personally, I don't find myself using a lot of these features, but at least they are there just in case, and Gigabyte remain very competitive in this area. Response time performance is next up, and we'll start with the first of three overdrive modes, called Picture Quality. This is Gigabyte's name for overdrive disabled, with the idea being no overshoot, and that's exactly what we get. However, an average response time of 8.94 milliseconds is relatively slow for a 240Hz monitor, and is not sufficient for this refresh rate, so let's enable overdrive. The first of two modes with overdrive is the bounce mode. At 240Hz, we still don't see much overshoot, and the average response time has increased somewhat now to around the 8 millisecond mark. While this is an improvement and cumulative deviation is respectable, it's still short of the performance required for a true 240Hz experience. The other available overdrive mode is speed. Here we get the performance we are looking for. A 5.06 millisecond greater gray average is solid, and while that doesn't provide amazing refresh compliance, we're still sitting on the border of a true 240Hz experience, and clearly good enough for lower refresh rates. The lack of inverse ghosting, aside from a small cluster of dark overshoot, is quite good in this mode. However, what you'll find in the speed mode as the refresh rate decreases is that overshoot increases. Average response times still sit in the 4.5 to 5.0 millisecond range, which is decent, but around the 144Hz mark, and particularly at 120Hz, we start to get a significant amount of inverse ghosting that is noticeable during gameplay. At 85Hz and 60Hz as some examples, the inverse ghosting rate is over 50%, which is not good and means you'll see noticeable inverse ghosting on the screen. On the other hand, we have the bounce mode, which is too slow for ideal performance at the higher end of the refresh range, but manages to maintain a negligible amount of overshoot right down to 60Hz, with performance that can be as good as around 6.5 milliseconds. So if you are planning on using this monitor at lower refresh rates, then there is a suitable option. Unfortunately though, this does mean the FI27Q-X does not have a single overdrive setting that's suitable for gaming across the entire refresh range. Based on our testing, the speed mode is best for gaming above 120Hz, while the bounce mode is better for gaming below 120Hz without inverse ghosting. If you want the best experience, you'll need to switch between these modes depending on the games you are playing and the performance you are getting. This is not great from a high-end monitor. Generally, when you're paying upwards of $600 for a display, I would expect good performance at all refresh rates in a single mode. What Gigabyte needed to do here was either implement variable overdrive so that the display automatically switches between the bounce and speed modes depending on the refresh rate, or create additional overdrive modes, possibly something between bounce and speed. So I think having just 3 modes probably isn't sufficient here. When comparing the FI27Q-X to other monitors, this display performs reasonably well, but not to the level of other 1440p 240Hz monitors that I've tested. Here, testing at 240Hz using the speed mode, a 5 millisecond gray to gray average with low overshoot is good, but the PG279QM, for example, can do the same thing with 24% faster response times. The Samsung Odyssey G7 is a step above again in terms of speed. Then when looking across the refresh range using the best overdrive mode for adaptive sync gaming, in this case the bounce mode to avoid inverse ghosting, the FI27Q-X again falls behind other displays that we've tested and is more of a mid-tier model. The AW2721D does have high levels of overshoot, but comes out 26% faster. And if we did switch the FI27Q-X to its speed mode, the display would be roughly as fast as the PG279QM, just with double the inverse ghosting rate. So either way you cut it, the FI27Q-X isn't as good as these monitors. Cumulative deviation tells us how close the monitor's transition response gets to the ideal instant response. This is the most favorable result for the FI27Q-X we've seen yet, compared to the AW2721D, showing that overall these monitors are quite close in terms of the general response they are able to produce. However, both the PG279QM and Odyssey G7 are a step ahead and end up near the top of this chart, which is where you'd want a 240Hz display to be. Dark level performance is fine with this IPS type display, however we don't see performance as strong as the Samsung Odyssey G7, which has solved dark level smearing with VA panels. Next up, we have some fixed refresh rate testing. At 120Hz, the FI27Q-X is a mid-table monitor, fairly typical compared to what we've seen previously where overshoot is low but response times are not amazing. However, this turns into a strength at 60Hz, where this monitor is able to outperform the AW2721D and get close to the PG279QM. Not sure how many people will be buying a 240Hz monitor to use it at 60Hz, but it's still worth mentioning at least. The FI27Q-X is a low latency display with under 0.5 milliseconds of processing delay on the monitor side. Combined with a high 240Hz refresh rate and moderately fast response times, this display is overall quite a responsive monitor that feels snappy to use. Power consumption is slightly better than other monitors with similar specifications that I've tested. Unlike its competitors from Alienware and Asus, the FI27Q-X does support backlight strobing at fixed refresh rates between 100Hz and 240Hz. However, when you enable this mode, you'll spot severe inverse ghosting in games and also in Blurbuster's UFO test, whether you're playing at 240Hz or 100Hz. You cannot change the overdrive mode when backlight strobing is enabled, making this feature practically worthless as the artifacts are too noticeable. Next up is color performance, and it's important here first up to talk about how the FI27Q-X uses a BGR subpixel array, not the standard RGB. What this means is that with each pixel, instead of the usual layout of subpixels going red, green, blue from left to right, that order is reversed with blue, green, red used instead. This can cause issues when rendering text and images, as most operating systems and applications are expecting RGB LCD panels. The main question is, well, is this actually an issue? And the answer is, it depends. If you're running Windows and you use the ClearType utility, you can configure the operating system to render text correctly for a BGR panel instead of RGB, and that will remove any artifacts for the most part. However, not all applications and games support ClearType text, so at times you may still see some fringing. Operating systems that are not Windows may also struggle if they have no method to switch subpixel text rendering from RGB to BGR. Regardless of whether you can correct the issue in software or not, this is an added headache that buyers of an RGB subpixel monitor don't need to worry about. So in that sense, I see BGR as a drawback. Outside of the subpixel layout, the FI27Q-X is a wide gamut monitor, although its gamut coverage is a bit different to other displays. It supports 93% DCI P3 coverage in our testing, but also 100% Adobe RGB coverage, so it's more suited to Adobe RGB work than P3. This gives us 75% Rec 2020 coverage overall, not as good as the PG279QM, but thanks to its Adobe RGB support, better than LG-based models like the AW2721D. Gigabyte provides strong out-of-the-box grayscale accuracy. My unit had no noticeable color tint and great adherence to the sRGB gamma curve, which led to low delta E's. A delta E2000 average here of just above 2.0 indicates a reasonably accurate monitor, certainly above average for gaming displays. However, this is a wide gamut monitor with no sRGB mode enabled by default, so the FI27Q-X is oversaturated out of the box, and that leads to mediocre delta E results for saturation and color checker. Up against other displays, we can see that the factory grayscale calibration results are very good, up in the top handful of monitors I've tested. But due to its default oversaturation, factory color checker results are below average. The best way to improve performance if you're planning on mostly displaying sRGB or Rec 709 content like YouTube videos is to use Gigabyte's sRGB mode. This mode does have a functional sRGB clamp which emulates the color space correctly, significantly reducing delta E's and thus improving accuracy. You can see here that delta E ITP results are around the 4.0 mark, which is strong. However, the sRGB mode isn't perfect, and grayscale performance actually went backwards a bit compared to the default mode in terms of color temperature, although gamma has improved. Unfortunately, this sRGB mode is quite limited, with Gigabyte stupidly disabling color balance controls and only allowing brightness adjustments. There is no reason whatsoever for these settings to be disabled when choosing the sRGB mode, as grayscale is never perfect from the factory, and ideally you should be giving users the ability to tweak features. For true color accurate work, the best option is a full calibration which creates an ICC profile, and you can do this in either the sRGB or normal modes depending on whether you need the wide gamut or not. I tested here in the normal mode and got great results in both sRGB and D65P3, with the one exception being the top end of the P3 gamut, as overall coverage is only 93%. This is probably not quite good enough for professional P3 work. Adobe RGB is the stronger gamut on this display. Peak brightness is very good, with the FI27Q-X capable of around 440 nits, which should be easily suitable for most bright viewing environments. You also get minimum brightness of 41 nits, so the panel is also great for those that like to dim down their monitor for viewing in the dark. This monitor's contrast ratio is average for an IPS panel, falling around 950:1, which is very similar to other 1440p 240Hz IPS monitors that I've looked at so far. But in the general landscape of monitors, this contrast ratio is bad, given that a display like the Odyssey G7 will give you more than double the contrast, significantly improving black levels. The darker your general viewing environment, the more noticeable this low contrast ratio will be. Viewing angles are excellent as you'd hope for from an IPS panel. Meanwhile, uniformity is great. You'll see that almost the entire center section has delta E's of less than 2.0 relative to the center, with only a slight fall off along the outer left and right edges, so this is a great result all up. However, you may spot a bit of backlight bleed and IPS glow depending on the unit. My unit certainly wasn't perfect in this regard. Lastly, we have HDR performance, given that Gigabyte has gotten their monitor display HDR 400 certified. However, with no local dimming support and a totally insufficient native contrast ratio for HDR content, the FI27Q-X is fundamentally not an HDR monitor, as it lacks the proper hardware support to display bright and dark content on the screen at the same time. It may be able to accept HDR inputs, but that doesn't mean it can display HDR content as intended. Overall, the Gigabyte Aorus FI27Q-X is one of those monitors that lives and dies by its competition and spot in the market. Because taken in isolation, this is a fine monitor. It can produce decent response times and a high refresh rate with low input lag. It has great color performance in some areas, like its wide gamut support and grayscale calibration, and the build quality is very good, befitting of a high-end monitor. At the same time, it's not really a class-leading display in any area. Take response times as an example. The FI27Q-X has good performance, but you'll get up to 25% faster performance and a single overdrive mode experience from a display like the PG279QM. The FI27Q-X doesn't have variable overdrive like some of its competitors that use a true G-Sync module, and unfortunately that leads to a 2 overdrive mode situation for variable refresh rate gaming. The one unique feature the FI27Q-X does have up its sleeve in backlight strobing also isn't that good, and certainly not a selling point. And then on the side of color performance, we're getting typical brightness, typical contrast, typical viewing angles compared to other displays, its wide gamut, similar color space coverage, good factory calibration in some areas, weaker in others, but it's let down by the use of a BGR subpixel array, weaker factory calibration than the PG279QM, and worse contrast than Samsung's Odyssey G7. Again, it's largely a situation where performance is good, but it lacks that outstanding feature or area of performance that would separate it from its competitors. So if I'm looking at the 1440p 240Hz IPS monitors I've tested so far, the FI27Q-X is probably the weakest offering in terms of performance, but it's also the cheapest. For example, the PG279QM and AW2721D are better, but cost over $800 compared to the FI27Q-X's price tag of $700 or lower. Thankfully, this means we aren't in a situation where Gigabyte are charging too much, which was the case with some of their prior Aorus releases. However, that doesn't necessarily mean I would recommend the Aorus as the best bang for buck option either. In this high-end market, buyers are more likely to fork out the extra cash to get the better Alienware or Asus monitors, which is working against Gigabyte a bit here. I mean, the AW2721D is only 20% more expensive or so in the US, which isn't that much for premium buyers. In Australia, the Dell monitor is actually cheaper, so as always, there will be some regional discrepancies, and locally, there is no way I'd recommend the FI27Q-X over the Alienware alternative. The other option is, of course, the Samsung Odyssey G7, which has a 27-inch model at the same $700 MSRP. For gaming, the Odyssey G7 is the better display, but it does have drawbacks like its aggressive curve, which may put people off, especially if you want something with more versatility. All up, it's hard to definitively recommend the FI27Q-X, but it's also hard to definitively not recommend it, if you get what I mean. It's not a bad product, but whether it's right for you may come down to specific needs, how much you can afford to spend, and pricing in your region. I'd tend to gravitate towards the other options, but again, your needs may be a bit different to mine. Anyway, that's it for this review. So if you're interested in supporting our monitor testing, you can do so via our Patreon and Floatplane accounts, links in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to things like monthly live streams, you'll get access to ICC profiles that we generate for these reviews. There's our Discord community as well if you want to come in and ask monitor questions at any time. And yeah, that's about it. Hopefully you've got the information you need for your next monitor purchase, and I'll catch you in the next one.